Almost every major plant ecosystem, primarily in the West, but some in the East as well, are influenced by fire periodically. But the timing of the fires, in other words, how long the interval is between fires, and the severity of the fire, ecologists talk about low severity, mixed severity, and high severity fires. Low severity fire is one that doesn't kill like mature trees. A high severity fire is where a lot of mature trees are killed. So, and mixed is in between. So anyway, most of the plant communities in the Western United States, with very few exceptions, are regularly visited by wildfire, but it may be every 200 years, or someplace like the coast of Washington or Oregon, it might be every 500 years because it's wet and cool. And then other plant communities might be natural for a fire to happen every 10 or 20 years. But those are very a small percentage of Western plant communities. And one of the myths out there is that this idea that fire was always frequent and low severity, in other words, not killing major trees, was the common denominator across most of the West, which is not accurate. And a lot of the forest policies have been developed based on that theory. Anyway, one of the reasons why fire, I hesitate to call them good or bad and put those kind of, those are our value systems on them. But one of the things that you will find is that many plants and animals actually depend on wildfire as part of their life cycle. So, for example, in the West here, in the Northern Rocky Mountains and other areas, more than 50% of the bird species use the snags and down logs that result from a high severity fire for their life cycle. And it's not just woodpeckers, it's all kinds of, bluebirds live in cavities in trees. The eagles nest in snags. There are other birds like nuthatches. They feed on the bark of the trees, and a whole lot of other things that surprise people, even like there are many species of bats that roost in the flaky bark underneath a dead tree. And then when logs fall into a stream, particularly small and mid-sized streams, that creates all kinds of habitat for both aquatic insects as well as for fish. So you tend to have more fish in streams that have more logs in them. And a really interesting thing is because there's more habitat for aquatic insects, you actually have more bats and birds that feed above those streams that have a lot of wood in them. So it shows how this goes through the whole, ecosystem chain, so to speak. So that's one of the you could say positive impacts, or at least things that favorably happen. Another is that when a fire comes through, especially a high severity fire, it will kill the trees, but it produces a lot of charcoal. And charcoal stores carbon for thousands of years when it gets in the soil. And even dead trees, and this is another one of the misinformation, even dead trees store a lot of carbon. So you'll hear opponents, people who think that we should be trying to contain or suppress wildfires, saying, well, we're releasing carbon in the atmosphere, which you are, but it's a small percentage because what burns in a wildfire is what we call the fine fuels, like the pine needles, the cones, the small branches. That's why you get snags. The bigger trees don't burn up, they survive, and that's all carbon. And the roots in the ground is all carbon. And yet, comparatively, when you log a site, you're taking that wood and you're chipping it up and sawing it up and so forth, and all that small material gradually releases carbon in the atmosphere right away. Or we make it into something like paper that doesn't store it that long. And even in buildings, it doesn't store it nearly as long as it does in a natural forest ecosystem. One of the controversies in the West right now is one of the prescriptions for preventing large wildfires they want to do is log. And the irony of that is two things. One, it releases way more carbon in the atmosphere now to prevent a fire that may not happen for 100 years. So, and meanwhile, that forest is storing all that carbon. And even after a fire, it's storing more carbon than if you logged it. So, given that we should be trying to reduce our carbon input into the atmosphere now. The fact that logging releases all this carbon is not a good way to react to it. And the second thing that's important is logging the forest, particularly thinning, which is where they go and they take maybe 50% of the trees, not all the trees, like in a clear cut. It opens up the forest to more drying and to more wind penetration. And what you will find is that the most important criteria in a large, high severity fire is wind. And wind is not linear in its influence. The higher the wind speed, it doubles, quadruples, etc., its ability to carry embers. And that is one of the reasons why you can't really fight a fire under those conditions. When you have a 50-mile-an-hour wind, you have embers being blown ahead of the fire front, sometimes several miles. So if you thin the forest, you open it up so the wind penetration is greater to carry away those embers and deposit them in front of the existing fire front, which spreads the fire much faster. It is also embers that wind up burning down most homes. Most of the homes that have burned in the West are not the result of a fire just coming, big wall of fire like you see in the movies or even in some news clips, arriving at the edge of a house and burning it down. What it usually is embers falling on the roof that have pine needles on it in the gutters, or embers starting a fire in brush that's adjacent to the house, and then the brush catches the house on fire and so forth. So wind carried embers is the main contributor to house losses and structural loss. So all this suggests that thinning, thinning doesn't stop the wind. Thinning doesn't, effectively deal with what drives wildfires. And the other criteria that's important to note is that all large wildfires, and I've been to literally dozens and dozens of large fires around the West to see how they burned and under what conditions. And there's a common denominator in all. One, they tend to be under extreme drought conditions with very low humidity, abnormally low humidity, and high temperatures along with wind. So if you have all those ingredients, then you get a fire that's pretty much impossible to stop. And it doesn't happen everywhere. And to get all those things to line up at the same time is actually fairly rare. But when it happens, that's when you get these fires that burn, 500,000 acres. And they don't stop until you change those variables. I remember reading a typewritten report in the 1930s that was done in Yellowstone Park. And it was this ranger's report on a wildfire. And he said, we finally got the fire under control, but it had a hell of a time breaking camp in the rain. And, like he didn't really see the connection between, who got the fire under control. It was the rain that got the fire under control, not you, um, and and that's a very common situation. If you listen to the media, they'll talk about they've been fighting a fire for a week or whatever, and then they'll say, well, it rained and the firefighters got the fire under control. Well, no, nature got the fire under control, and we take credit for it. And another factor in that whole situation is, and people should not be surprised by the size of the large fires that we see, is that around most of the West right now, we're under extreme drought conditions. Even California, with all the snow and water it had this year, is still under drought. It's not as extreme as it was, but uh, and drought is one of the premier ingredients in large wildfires. The Southwest, California and Oregon and so forth were what they called the worst drought in 1,000 years. Well, I can tell you that if you look back, it's called paleoclimate ecology, of fire ecology. You can find places and time when we had similar extreme droughts, and not surprisingly, there were very large wildfires all across the West during those time periods. And so, for example, there was a thing called the medieval warm spell between about 800 AD and about 1300 AD. And there were a lot of fires all across the West, and much larger fires than were common until recently in these places. And that was the same time when the Anasazi Indians abandoned their cliff dwellings because of extreme drought. That was the same time that the Vikings colonized Greenland because it was greener, because it was warmer. There, we even have human events that are correlated with these, major drought conditions. And right now, of course, the drought conditions we're having are a direct result of our carbon emissions. And it's a really funny thing, Julia. When I was starting college, the professors were taught the United States, North America, was actually in a cold, snowy period, and there was concern we were entering another ice age. And in my classes we'd be talking about what are we going to do if the glaciers start moving south again and all this stuff. And uh, and 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 there are records of increased glaciation and peaks in the Pacific Northwest, etc. Glaciers were growing then, and that was the time period when the advocates of thinning and fire suppression say they were successful at suppressing fires. No, they weren't. Nature was suppressing fires because the climate wasn't conducive to fires. And then what happened was all the emissions we've been pouring into the atmosphere finally started to catch up with us, and it reversed what was a natural trend towards cold and wet. Had we not been dumping CO2 in the atmosphere, we might have been in an ice age now, or a growing ice age. And what happened is the CO2, which we know, traps heat, started to reverse that natural trend towards the cold. And and again, causing extensive drought and so forth. So to me, it's like if you study this paleoclimate stuff, it all makes sense that we have large fires now. It's not because there's more fuel on the ground. It's because of the climate conditions. And I'll tell you one example. Very little research has been done on this, partly because it's hard to find a place to do this kind of research, and the other is that in many ways the agencies don't want to find this research. But there was a study done in Yellowstone Park where, starting in 1972, when it was the ice age was happening, where they decided not to suppress any fires. In other words, they just let the fires burn and see what happens. They continued that policy all the way up to 1988, when 1 million acres burned in the Yellowstone area. And I'll get to that in a minute. But between 1972 and 1988, they had 235 fires that they did not do anything to control. And 222 of them did not burn more than 1 acre and went out on their own. And, a few got larger, up to 100 acres. One was 1,000 acres, but they all went out on their own without anybody, human intervention at all. So what happened? Okay, so it was there. Why did you get 1 million acres burning in 1988 when in 1987, maybe you had a few fires that burned a couple of acres? Or in 1986, was it because there was suddenly more fuel? Well, that's ridiculous. There's the same amount of fuel. But what happened was the summer of 1988 was the driest summer on record since they started keeping records in Yellowstone in 1872. And it was also a summer where they had some winds blowing more than 50 miles an hour on many days. And the humidity got so low, even the internal moisture of the trees in the park area was down to 1 to 2% internal moisture. Kiln dried lumber that you build with is 15% moisture. So this is a wood that they've put into an oven to dry it out, was way more moist than what happened naturally. And so you have these trees just ready to burn. They kind of go up like they're got gasoline on them, because, and this is another important point. This is all these things are sort of counterintuitive. Green trees are more burnable than dead trees because they have all these needles and stuff on them. Plus, if they're very dried out, like was in Yellowstone, they have all these resins that are actually very flammable in the needles and so forth. So if you ignite a fire under those conditions, it is like gasoline on these trees. They just explode into flames. And so and since 88 that we've just been pouring more and more carbon in the atmosphere. Just last week or the week before, I read an article that said that we now are at a point where we have more carbon in the atmosphere than any time in the last 4 million years. which is large, basically that's all of Homo sapiens evolution. So we are experiencing something, not that it hasn't happened before, because there have been natural sources of CO2, like there have been major volcanic eruptions and things like that periodically through geological time that put a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. But we and most of the plant communities and animals haven't experienced so much CO2 in a long, long time. And so one of the consequences is how that changes the climate and weather patterns. So not only do you get more wildfires, warming oceans, for example, is one of the things that sustains higher velocity hurricanes, and warming temperatures of the oceans will shift the distribution of fishes and so forth. So there's a lot of secondary effects of the changes in temperature that we're seeing that is more than just wildfires. So anyway, we have increased those conditions, and the way that people there's a whole set of people out there, and I think a lot of them are misguided, not viciously or anything like that, maliciously, but misguided in their solution. It There's this idea, just sort of like from campfire lore, that the more wood you put on the fire, the bigger you get a bonfire, right? So obviously the way to get away from a bonfire is to take away some of that wood, and but it's a lot more complicated than that because of all these other feedback mechanisms we're talking about. But that has become the dominant prescription, which is to do more logging in an attempt to reduce the fuel loads. But what my experience has been is that there's sort of a threshold that's triggered where you get to a point where the fuels are less important. In other words, when the weather supersedes, climate supersedes the fuel level. I mean, I've seen fires race across places that were grazed down to 1 inch stubble, and if the wind is blowing, you got the flame may not be real big when you got 1 inch stubble, but it still might be a foot high, and it races across the grass till it gets to some place where there's more fuel. And you can't, and it's blowing embers ahead, and so the logging prescription, I mean, unless you were to eliminate trees and vegetation over huge areas, you're not going to get any positive result. And the other thing is, since you can't predict where a fire is going to be, I've gone out with Forest Service on tours and stuff, and they're advocating thinning the forest, and I say, well, so can you tell me when the next fire is going to be? And of course, they think I'm a fool asking that, but it's a legitimate question because, as I said, the fire interval in a lot of plant communities is hundreds of years. So if I go out and thin now, immediately vegetation starts growing back. And a lot of times the vegetation that grows back, at least initially, is fine fuels like more grass and shrubs. That is what wildfires feed on. So, in 10 years, you may have made the conditions there worse by favoring the kind of vegetation that's most flammable to grow back on that site. And as I said, the trees, the large trees don't really burn. It's the needles and stuff on the trees. So cutting down large trees to reduce the fire, which are not very flammable, and increasing the presence of small plants like grasses and shrubs and so forth and small trees is counterproductive. And then also, is the area likely to burn? Well, probably not. Studies have shown about a 1% chance. And then you get into this whole thing that thinning and logging the forest has a lot of collateral damage. So, for example, to log, you got to build logging roads. Well, logging roads are a major vector for the spread of weedy plants, particularly flammable weedy plants like cheatgrass. Logging roads also disturb wildlife. Logging roads are a major source of sedimentation in streams. When you remove log the trees, you're removing carbon from the forest. You're removing potentially the dead trees and snags. Even without a fire, you're going to have periodic mortality, obviously, and that allows trees to die and fall on the forest floor, and mice hide under it or fungi grow on it, etc. So you have you have all this collateral damage that is done, and it may not have a fire come. So you're trading a certainty of damage against something that may not do anything to prevent a fire because the fire doesn't happen. And even if the fire does happen, if you have these extreme conditions, it doesn't prevent the fire anyway. And the corollary of that, and this is an important point, because you'll see studies saying, well, thinning seemed to slow fires or whatever. Almost always, if you read those carefully, it's under conditions of less than extreme fire weather conditions. Under less than extreme fire weather conditions, you get what happened in Yellowstone Park, which is the fires go out on their own. So we attribute, there may be a little bit of a increase in the situation where the thinning might slow a fire or something like that. But in the conditions where that is really effective, fires aren't really a threat. We can stop them anytime we want, and nature stops them if we just leave them alone. And under the conditions where it's extreme, we can't stop them, and thinning doesn't stop them. In fact, it may enhance the spread. There's been some studies that have shown, and there's a review studies, and review studies are particularly good because, if you were to interview another person that was supportive of thinning, they would point to studies that show that thinning works. And that's has to do with the variability of the conditions that are out there. Topography affects how fires burn, the weather conditions on a particular day. So everybody can find some study that supports their particular perspective. But review studies are good because they look at lots and lots of situations, and so statistically they can show things that maybe an individual study won't show. So for example, there's one review study that looked at 1,500 wildfires across the West, and it found that in areas where there was what a favorite euphemism of the timber industry is active forest management, which means logging. Where there was active forest management, they actually had higher severity fires than in places that were protected, where presumably there's more fuel building up, like national parks and wilderness areas. So a review like that has some value because it sort of negates all these outliers that could be out there. And so there are any number of studies that show that, and observationally, anecdotally, from my experience of looking at a lot of wildfires, that's the way it is also. I've gone, like I said, to dozens and dozens of fires where they've done thinning and prescribed burning and so forth to no avail, and does not appear to be an effective strategy. Now, one thing that goes on with the whole fire situation is that you could call it the fire industrial complex. There's all kinds of people whose jobs depend on fighting fires or thinning forests. And so one of the things I do when I read scientific papers is I look to see what the affiliation of the person is. And this is not, this is sort of a generalization. Of course, it's not across the board, but I have found, again, I think if I were to do a review paper of scientific papers on fire, this trend would show up, which is professors and researchers associated with forestry schools tend to be much more advocates of logging, and people that are in other areas that also study fire, like geography departments, botany departments, geology departments, and so forth, tend to be less enthusiastic about thinning and logging as a solution to the issue. And that's a real factor of follow the money. Oregon State University, I live in Oregon, gets 20 to 25% of its funding every year from the timber industry. And if you don't think that that somewhat influences what professors study, you're naive and the conclusions they have. And a lot of times their researchers will, at the end of their paper, they'll say, "Thank you to the Forest Service for funding my study," or whatever. Well, that's a clue to, the Forest Service doesn't like to fund people they know are going to come up with answers they don't want. And if you're in the forestry school or whatever, even if you're not a big advocate of logging, you know you know where your funding's coming from. And this is the irony of academics. If you're an academic, the way you get more status within the academic community, as well as a result, better pay, is by publishing papers. And how do you publish papers? Well, one of the key ingredients to publishing papers, a lot of papers, is having graduate students. How do you have graduate students? Well, you got to get funding. So the more funding you get, the more graduate students you have. And each one of those graduate students is involved in some research that they're doing. They do most of the work, and you, as the professor, are sort of like the supervisor, and then you get your name on the paper. And so, if you have a lot of money for graduate students, you might be able to publish, 5 or 10 papers a year. And somebody who doesn't have any grad students would be lucky if they got one. Well, who's going to get advancement in the school and become a full professor sooner and so forth? And it sort of self feeds, because if you publish a lot, you get more funding then to keep on doing more research. So anyway, those factors people aren't aware of, but that's one of the things that contributes to what we see. And then you have, independent researchers, or people, like I said, that might be in a geography department or a geology department, and they often come to different conclusions about fires and fire ecology than those in the forestry schools. And there's also a debate out there that you should be aware of concerning what methodologies are used to determine past fire histories. The most common method is called the fire scar method, where you go through if a fire doesn't kill a tree, it often will scar it, and the scar heals over. And if you can find the scars, you can cut down that tree. If it survives a number of fires, you can count the tree rings between them and get some sense of how common fires were in that particular place where that tree was growing. But the problem with the fire scar methods is severalfold. One, it's not a random thing. You go looking for trees that have scars. And the analogy I make, it's like going into a bar and asking how many people like alcohol, and then saying, okay, 100% of the people here like alcohol, and then extending and extrapolate it to a whole community. And so the trees that are selected that have scars may not be representative of the fire in that whole region or area, but a lot of times they suggest it is. So that's the first problem. And then this is really getting into the weeds, but there's another problem where they do what's called composite fire years. So if, as I mentioned, like in Yellowstone, where the majority of fires were 1 acre, um, just because you find a scar for a particular year, it may be one tree that burned that year, or just a few trees, an acre of land. But when they do their composite, they count all the years that they could find a fire scar as a year of a fire, when it may have been just one tree in that whole region burned that year because lightning struck it, and and so the more years you add into your composite, the shorter the interval grows. So you are statistically biasing your findings towards shorter fire frequency, and then that's driving the fire policies. And then these other divisions, like geologists, for example, one of the ways that they look at fires, they go around and look for major sediment flows, because if you have a really big fire, there'll be measurable more sediment. Well, that picks up the big fires that burn large areas. And I think that's a much more, because it's only the large fires we have to worry about. And when they do those studies, they find, well, the fire frequency is much lower. And then same with the others do pollen studies in the soil, because after a fire you have different plants come in, and that we recorded in pollen that's in the soil. Then there's using cores in lakes for charcoal, and the point of it is there's all these other methods for determining the past history of fires, and they almost all tend to favor a longer fire rotation than those from fire scar studies. So that makes a whole, so whose fire studies are you using, and which is more valid? And so that's a sort of a issue that's there that most people aren't aware of, and depending upon what area on the spectrum you are, you may use one of those methods more than others to determine what the history is. And then the other thing that's going on is they say, well, we're going to thin because we're going to restore the historic forest conditions. Well, the historic forest conditions are a direct result of the climate at that time. We're not in the same historic climate. So it's a fool's errand to try to say, oh, we're going to restore the forest to something of 200 years ago or 300 years ago, because the climate conditions 200 or 300 years ago were entirely different than they are now. And so that's another problem with the whole issue. And then finally, you'll hear forest advocates of logging to say they're going to increase the resilience of the forest so that the trees don't die from insects or disease or wildfire or drought. And a real problem with that, there's several problems. One, that's just a typical human-centric view of forests. You know, all those sources of mortality are important to a healthy forest ecosystem. Dead trees have a role to play in the forest ecosystem, and the assumption that you shouldn't have dead trees is, you know, that's a lumberman's perspective, but that's not from a forest perspective. And the other problem is when you log, you're non-selective. What I mean by that is there is variation in all these forests and plant communities in their natural resilience to whether it's drought or insects or whatever. And you cannot tell by walking through the forest that this tree is more drought resistant than that tree. And yet I might go over and cut down the tree that's the most drought resistant, saying that I'm increasing the resistance of the forest when I've actually degraded the resistance of the forest. So that's another problem with the whole logging scheme for resilience. First of all, it's just wrong-headed to try to prevent mortality. And these plant communities are shifting now, which some people see with alarm, but it's exactly what you would expect in evolution. In other words, shifting, what I mean by that is some of the forest stands at lower elevation are not coming back as forests. Well, that makes sense. If it's drier conditions, it's a place where trees can't grow anymore. And so it's just natural that you're going to have that kind of situation. And it's all about treating the symptoms rather than the causes, which is, of course, that we have too much CO2 in the air and we got to deal with that. If we deal with that, all this other stuff goes away. And obviously, that's a hard thing to deal with. And that's why they take the symptoms, because it's easier.
I was wondering if you could also talk about salvage logging and the impact that that has.
Yeah. Okay. As I mentioned, snags and down wood are very critical to healthy forest ecosystems. Just to make a point, I anthropomorphize a little bit. I say there are all kinds of birds and plants and mammals that are out there that live in fear of green forests. Because they really depend on the dead trees. And when they do salvage logging, they remove the thing that all these other animals and plants depend on. So they're reducing the I when I see those dead trees, I see it as wildlife habitat, you know, not as lumber. And so it's very critical to healthy ecosystems to have those trees stand there for as long as and sometimes they'll stand for 100 years as snags, and then gradually fall over on the ground, and they last another 100 years on the ground sometimes, depending on how dry the ecosystem is and so forth. Or they fall into a stream and they last many hundreds of years in cold water. So they're a physical structure, they're carbon storage, they play a really critical role in the forest ecosystem sort of renewal process. So salvage logging is super detrimental. And of course, not only are you taking trees away, you usually have to build the roads and all that have all those secondary collateral damages that I mentioned earlier, like spread of weeds or disturbance of wildlife or sediment in streams. And that's the sediment in streams is an interesting thing, because one of the justifications they give for preventing fires is they say, well, we want to keep sediment out of the streams. Well, a couple of things. One, all the aquatic species in the West, because fires have always occurred, are adapted to periodic fires. And studies have shown, again, not to say good or bad, but studies have shown that after a fire, you often have more fish in a stream, bigger fish, and more insects. Uh, there's a delay of a number of years, but eventually you have more. And even the sedimentation that may result will, if it's the right size gravel and so forth, is important for spawning salmon and so forth. But the difference is, logging roads are chronic sources of sedimentation. In other words, if you have a wildfire, you may not have any reproduction for a year or two from say trout in that stream. They may have either been totally wiped out by too much sediment and takes a while for them to swim back in and recolonize, or they're at such low numbers they essentially, not producing many fish, young. But that input only lasts for a few years, because what happens is on most fires, even high severity fires, within a few years you start getting lots of plants growing back that covers the ground and reduces the sedimentation. But logging roads are there all the time, and their banks are eroding and the road surface is eroding and putting sediment in streams year after year after year, which is why logging has been so detrimental to fisheries on the West Coast, because the fish are adapted to episodic, rare events, but not constant, chronic events.
Thank you for that. And in terms of policy, what should be done differently?
All right. Well, that's a good one. I'm glad you brought that up. We have to make some big differences, overall reduce CO2. Okay, that's at the big level. But even in the interim, what can we do? Well, one thing we can do is harden homes. We, instead of spending money logging 30 miles from towns and communities, you can do a lot to make your house or home less likely to burn. They just had a study done in California that looked at the Paradise, California fire. That was the one that burned like 19,000 structures. And what they concluded were some pretty simple things, like putting gravel or at least eliminating vegetation 5 feet around the foundation of your house. That's a pretty simple thing. If you do that one thing, you have a 50% greater chance of surviving a fire from just doing that. Having screens on vents in the ceilings, having a metal roof, cleaning your gutters out. These are all very simple things that make it much less likely that a windblown ember, will start a fire. One of the interesting things about fires too is you really need to make these as community requirements. And the reason is even if I do that on my house, okay, I do all that great stuff. I live in a typical suburban neighborhood right here. My neighbor's house on both sides are about 10 feet apart from my house. So if my neighbor doesn't do it and his house catches on fire, that puts out so much heat, my house is going to burn down, even though I've done supposedly the right things to reduce fire. So you can do these simple things of home hardening for a lot less money and with a lot less damage to the forest, plant communities, if you work from the house outward. And then you need to do other things like plan evacuations. Like one of the things that happened in that Paradise fire in California, there were only 2 roads out of town. And people, a lot of people don't have their cars filled with gas, right? So you're going down the road, somebody runs out of gas, it backs up the traffic, other people run out of gas. People were abandoning their cars on the road, so everybody else couldn't get out on those roads. They had to bring bulldozers down to push the cars off the road so they could continue evacuations. Some people died because of that. So so thinking about, what are you going to do if you have to like get a whole town emptied out in a matter of an hour or so? There may not be a good solution, but you got to be thinking about it. Like I live here in Bend, Oregon, where half the town is built on one side of the Deschutes River and the other half on the other side. And there's only 5 bridges across the river. And already at, 5 o'clock, the traffic backs up for, many blocks because of the bottleneck created by the bridges. Now imagine if half the town on one side had to get across those bridges in an hour's time. It's a disaster waiting to happen. And I don't know if Ben's thought about what they would do about this, but I certainly would be, giving great thought to that, because that may be the weak link in the chain. So anyway, so home hardening and preparing for evacuations is much more sensible. And the reason partly too, as I mentioned, even though like where I live in Bend, Oregon is a place I can guarantee you we're going to have a fire here sooner or later. But it's sooner or later. It might not be for 50 years. So, but it could be this summer. So you have to be thinking of, what may happen, but you don't have to be in a panic or say, well, I can't live here because my house might burn up. Yeah, you might be dead before the next fire comes along. And and uh and so that to me is the way to treat this stuff, and to be somewhat judicious about things like you don't want to have a tree right next to your house that's might start on fire and then start the house on fire. I went to a house that burned in Montana, and it was a very simple thing. Somebody had one of those little plants planters that are like ferny things, where you put the plants in, and they had it hanging by a rope on their porch. And an ember got into the planter, which started on fire, which then burned the rope, and the planter fell to the wooden deck of the house, and then the wooden deck caught on fire and it burned the whole house down. And they had done they had a metal roof and had done a lot of the right things, but it was like that sort of like what do they call it, a black swan event, where something you don't predict. So you got to think about that. Another example of that is another fire. I didn't go to this fire, but I read about it. It was down in the Los Angeles area where half of the houses burned down. About 50 houses burned in this area, and in every case, it was because they had doggy doors. And so, what are doggy doors about? Well, they're made to swing open easily, and in a high wind, they swing open, and the embers blew into the houses that had them and burned the houses down. So, who thinks about their doggy doors as a potential, fire thing? So, if they're, that would be a very simple thing to fix. You could have some sort of latch that you could latch, as you're leaving the house. You could have your little checklist. Okay, I got to evacuate my house. Latch the doggy door, and maybe your house won't burn down because of that one little action you made. So anyway, that's where I think the emphasis should be, getting people prepared to deal with wildfire should they occur, and think about that. Like, here's one other thing, like, because of those traffic jams that I mentioned that people experience sometimes when everybody's trying to evacuate. This is my own self-survival, but if I had to evacuate my house here, one of the things to do is throw my bicycle on the back of my car. And if it was jammed up and I couldn't move, I'd get on the bike because I could weave in and out of all the cars and get away when other people might be just stuck in their cars. Yeah, just think about things like that. And which direction would you go? And so here in Bend, you would go east because it's desert and less likely to be on fire. So
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about related to that topic?
only, the self-obvious thing that there's a lot of incentives um, for people to be promoting thinning and those kind of things. And like I said, I think a lot of people genuinely believe they work, but there's also a financial incentive to promote those things. And like so many things, follow the money, and you will find that that often dictates policies. And so be aware of and be critical thinker on these things. And like I said, I don't discount everything that somebody's in a forestry school says. There's some really good researchers there too. But I the first thing I do is look at how that might influence a person's perspective, and and then be more aware of some of these common misinterpretations that I know exist.
Does the justification of preventing forest fires allow them to log more than they would normally be able to?
Well, that's what's happening now. Yes, and they're able to do it with a thing called categorical exclusions, which, and without getting in too much details, typically, if you're going to do logging, you have to do some sort of environmental analysis of the potential impacts and so forth. That's what's called the National Environmental Policy Act, and lay that out to the public. In other words, it doesn't prevent them from doing something, but they have to be honest about it. So they might do an analysis and they may come out and say, well, our logging roads are going to cause sedimentation in the stream and kill all the trout. But if they say that, they can go ahead and do the logging. But if they don't say that, and you can show that that's going to happen, then you can stop the logging. But with a categorical exclusion, they don't even have to do that. It's just they decide they're excluding that from that kind of a, detailed analysis to be able to go do the logging much more quickly. And so, yeah, it's one of the ways that, and with categorical exclusions, you can use it as often as you want over, there's a limit on how many acres can be, I think it's 3,000 acres, but that's a pretty big chunk of land. And you can do another categorical exclusion right next to the 3,000 acres you just logged. So, potentially you could log, tens of thousands of acres under categorical exclusions. Just keep making one exclusion after another. So that's that, holding the agencies accountable is difficult. And I know people that work for these agencies that disagree with this. But if you're going to keep your job, you don't have a choice. And the philosophy of my friends who work for the agencies is, and know a lot of this stuff is misguided, is, well, the bet what I'm going to do, partly because I don't want to lose my job, and partly because I'm in a position where I can maybe tweak these things somewhat. I might be able to get them to have fewer logging roads, or maybe I can get them to have a smaller amount of thinning, and so I can reduce the damage that I know is happening. And so that's how they sort of live with themselves. And if I were in the same position, I might, I'm not dependent on that salary. So, but if I was, I might try to do the same thing. So anyway. So I have a little sympathy for the position of a lot of these people. They're kind of stuck in a paradigm that's hard to shift and change.
What can we do to change that paradigm?
Well, what I'm trying to do is, do what I'm doing with you and other people, writing articles and giving talks. I'm giving a talk Wednesday out in Eastern Oregon, for example, to a watershed council group, all about these issues. And I don't necessarily, people's minds don't change usually right overnight. In fact, you got to be almost suspicious if they do. But what I try to do, and what I think happens, is I present ideas that they haven't heard before. And then when they read about or hear about something that like, for example, the idea that the chances of any place you've thinned is going to be encountered by fires, less than 1%. Well, that you may not have known that, and then you read about in another newspaper article or something where they say that same thing, and you say, I heard that before. And so maybe it doesn't make as much sense to do all this logging if there's such a low probability that it's going to have any influence at all. Or when they hear that logging roads are a big form of sedimentation. Oh, I never thought about that. And so it's a gradual change. It's like our whole, I can make all sorts of historical references, but a good one would be how just totally common thought around the whole world in all cultures that slavery was perfectly normal, and including in the United States. But just think how people would think if you said, "Well, let's go back to having slavery." I mean, you even the most diehard slave owners from 200 years ago today would not support that. So it's a gradual change, and that's what we have to accept and hope that. Um, and I think it's getting through. I think particularly the message that climate change is due to CO2 from humans, and that it's having major influences, not just on wildfires, but all sorts of other things, is finally, becoming commonly accepted. And even that wasn't really accepted, 10 or 15 years ago. You have to be able to first identify what the problem is properly, which we're finally getting around to, before you can be effective at dealing with it. And so hopefully we'll deal with it. Meanwhile, I think we're going to see a lot of fires across the West, and the best thing we can do is protect our homes and communities from that. Oh, one more thing I forgot to mention is a lot of the problems too, in terms of homes, is people building outside a city. Very few houses actually in cities burn up. There's some examples, but it's mostly houses that are off in the woods, and we spend a lot of money and even risk firefighters' lives trying to protect those isolated structures, and that can be prevented with good zoning.
Hmm.
So in Oregon, for example, they have urban growth boundaries around every single community, even a town with 500 people in it. And they had to, when the law was passed in 1972, they had to grandfather in, you know, structures that existed outside of those boundaries. But I can assure you that those urban growth boundaries have helped a lot in reducing losses in of homes in Oregon, because the statistics show if you build in the middle of a city, you're very unlikely to have your house burned down in a wildfire. It's houses on the edge of the towns, it's houses out in the woods, a mile from the edge of a town. And so that's another change that we can do immediately, start limiting where new construction can occur. Of course, that is easier said than done because of the resistance to it's my land and I can do whatever I want with it, attitude. And, understandable. Somebody has some property and they thought they were going to build their retirement house there, and suddenly you say, well, you can't. Suddenly the value of your land just went down a lot, and so forth. So people are going to fight that kind of thing. But you could do it with going forward.